support sustainability?
Yeah.
Which impact will they have? We're going to welcome Craig Morris. He's author of Energy Transition.be. It's an English ebook that explains the German energy transition to the world. Since 2010, he has covered the energy Wende at renewables.international.net. He has also been writing in the energy sector, mainly on policy, and this has been for more than 1 decade.
This goes back to what I learned a lot at IRENA. Some of the things that you can focus on that markets will not produce start with things like standards and best practices. Okay? If you're going to have a particular new technology take over, you might have to decide what kind of connectors you need, okay, for electric cars, for instance, which we don't really have yet. But if the French decide to have one connector, the Germans decide to have another, or the Chinese, you're going to have certain issues there. You could get together and coordinate these things, right? If you leave it up to the market, you see what happens with cell phones. If the EU had not stepped in, we would still have proprietary connectors for our cell phones. Okay? The reason why we have micro USB for so many devices is because of the EU, at least within the EU. So if you want to facilitate this, businesses do not have an interest necessarily in standardizing. They also may have an interest in proprietary. Okay? Another thing is best practices. The businesses will protect their own patents and their own inventions and their own bottom line, and not necessarily try to implement things that work very well in another country. Okay? There are numerous examples of this, and this goes along with international cooperation, the next one. If you just look in the energy sector, you can see, for instance, do you know about the microgeneration scheme in the UK? The microgeneration scheme in the UK is about 3 or 4 years old, and they basically said, okay, we will do feed-in tariffs. How many of you know what feed-in tariffs are? Okay, most people, 2/3. Feed-in tariffs were implemented in the UK, and I'll explain what they are a bit later. They were implemented, and the government said, well, okay, if we're going to have this small renewables, we need to certify this. We need to make sure the quality of the materials are good. This is because there was a bad experience in the UK about 10 years ago, where some really cheap stuff was put up and it didn't work right. Okay, so they responded and said, let's have our own standards. The problem is that actually the UK was late getting involved, and all this stuff was really good. Okay, we have international standards for photovoltaics, for instance, and the panels are good, and the inverters are good. And so all these companies had to go back in and recertify. And this actually slowed things down. And so you could just take, in other words, you can get the policies right or you can get them wrong here. So you'll want to coordinate everything with other countries and make sure that you're taking the best ideas. Another point is that subsidies already exist. So there's this notion that renewables need to reach a point where they can compete without subsidies. I think coal power needs to reach a point where it can exist without subsidies. I think the oil sector needs to reach a point, okay, where they can compete without subsidies. Don't get caught in this trap. These other technologies and energy sources have been out there for 200 years profitably. A company like Peabody in the United States is the largest coal producer. But when they are supposed to start researching CCS, carbon capture and storage, they get a grant from the US government to do so. Why? Why can't we just mandate that coal has to be cleaner? Okay? It's never going to be clean. But you could just expect this from profitable companies. So there's a double standard, and I would really advise everyone not to buy that logic. Don't start talking renewables have to be competitive and do without subsidies. Another big point that I'm going to talk about today is that market incumbents resist change. Think about how, this is infrastructure we're talking about. How long does infrastructure last? A power plant? 40 years. It will be extended. It's built for 40 years. It will be extended for maybe 60, right? Because it's just so big and it's so cheap to keep it running. The United States recently, I think last year, closed a coal plant that was 80 years old. It hadn't been running very much. But still, you see how long these things last. 80 years. That was the Great Depression. So if we're going to switch to renewables and we want to do so quickly, you've actually got to encourage companies to throw stuff away and close stuff down before it has become unprofitable. This is a bigger challenge. This is a bigger challenge than storage, for instance, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, the Valley of Death. What is meant by the Valley of Death? Has anyone heard of the Valley of Death? Yes? What would you say the Valley of Death is?
There's one phase in development which is critical.
Okay, and it's a valley because it starts off well, and then there's something in the middle that's a challenge, and then at the end it's okay too. But what's in the middle? Well, essentially up front you have what's called venture capital, or maybe it's governmental support. Maybe it's governments pushing research and development. So think maybe about electric cars. You've got Elon Musk producing Teslas. The guy apparently has money, you know, deep, deep pockets. So he's going to push this. In the end, you have mass production. Okay, so we have some rich guy producing, or venture capitalists with deep pockets, pushing everything in the beginning. In the end, we have mass production, and we know that that's going to be cheaper because that's generally the way mass production works. What do you have in the middle? A couple of people buying cars. Okay? And this is where governments can come in and solve, think of it as a chicken and an egg problem. Where are people going to charge their cars? Who's going to build the charging stations? The power companies are going to build the charging stations, but not until people start buying cars. So the power companies actually need a policy for people to buy automobiles. That's not even their sector. Okay? So you have industries that depend on each other. The car companies are waiting for the power companies, who are waiting for the car companies. That's a good time for the government to step in and say, okay, do we want to do this? And of course, a big question and a big risk here is, what if someone discovers in 5 years that fuel cells are the winner? Right? So we put all this into batteries, and then there's a breakthrough with fuel cells. Boy, is that bad. Okay, so there's a lot of risk involved in this. But this is at least where policies definitely play a role. Now, usually when we think of policies, we talk about things like targets, right? I mean, most people would, here in the EU, you would say, oh, we have this target 2020 by 2020, right? How much sense, by the way, does 2020 by 2020 make? Why isn't it 23% by 2019? Because nobody wants to hear that. So the targets of things like 20% by 2020, it's just marketing, all right? There's no good reason why we should go to 20 or stop at 20, all right? So keep that in mind when we talk about targets. But there are some good things about targets, but it's actually kind of complicated. Let's take a look at this. This is the targets for EU countries. Let's just take a look at these two, because there's too many. Let's take a look at Sweden and the UK. Okay, who thinks the UK is doing well? And who thinks Sweden's doing better? Who thinks Sweden's doing better? Most people. Who thinks the UK is doing better? Oh, come on. Well, think about it this way. The UK starts off low, and they're adding about 12%. Sweden is adding about 10%. So the UK is moving faster. Okay? Maybe like in Malta, which starts off at 0, maybe they don't have resources or something, right? Maybe Sweden is sitting on biomass and hydropower, and it made sense for them the whole time anyway. Okay? Now that happens not to be the case in the UK. The UK is the Saudi Arabia of wind power. Okay? But what I'm trying to point out here is that you can't look at targets and say whether they're good or bad. Not quickly. You have to really research it to see whether it's good or bad. Okay? For instance, you could also say, maybe the UK is moving 12 percentage points, and that's faster than Sweden's 10, but maybe the UK has the low cherries to pick, right? So maybe Sweden has already done the hard stuff. Like Germany. Germany's already done a lot of the easy stuff, and now it's going to do some hard stuff. Maybe the UK has all the easy stuff ahead of it, okay? So it's almost impossible to know just by looking at these targets until you study them closer. Now this is another aspect of targets, whether they're actually met. What happens if you don't meet your target? What you see here is the green represents countries that are ahead of their target. The sort of yellow-orange is countries that are on target, and the UK is not even going to meet its relatively low targets. Okay? So they're actually behind. But what happens, and incidentally there's gray countries as well for which there was no data available when this study was produced. Now within the EU, we will get the data. But this leads me to a couple of conclusions. One thing is, the best thing about targets is just that you collect data. Think about that for a minute. At IRENA, I saw researchers working with all these different member countries to talk about doubling the share of renewables. And they were talking with countries who told them, we're not sure how much renewables we have today. And so the first step was, can we figure this out together? How much do you have now? In what sector? What does it look like? So targets are good always as a starting point, just to get the discussion going. What happens if targets are not met? Make sure that it is better to install renewables than to miss your targets. Okay, you've got to have some kind of penalty where people are going to say, okay, I'm not paying that. I would rather build wind turbines and solar, or whatever, biomass, hydro, or whatever you're doing. Targets should also be defined as they are in German law as at least targets. Okay, if you go to the German EEG, the Renewable Energy Act, it says mindestens, at least 80% electricity and at least 60% energy will be renewable by 2050. Okay? You don't want to have a ceiling, because what happens is the markets approach that ceiling and they slow down automatically. They don't know if their project's going to get in or not. So things slow down. If your target is 20%, things slow down at 18 or 17%. They start hitting the brakes. And finally, technology neutral versus the bouquet. The more you do energy policy, the more you're going to hear this. We need to be technology neutral, let the market decide. Actually, what we need is a bouquet of renewables. If you are serious about switching to renewables, you need to do everything at once, because a lot of one source is going to raise your total costs in the end if you focus on just the cheap thing now. Okay? And I'll come back to a couple of examples of that. Now, we mentioned Germany a few times, and this, in fact, is a chart from the Energy Transition website. It shows you a couple of things. It shows you the 80 and 60% targets I just mentioned. It shows you also that there's a lot of emptiness here. Okay? And you see this everywhere you go. Countries all over the world have, if they have targets for electricity. You go into something like transport, and everyone's like the Germans. It's like, I don't know. We don't really have an idea about how this is going to work. You go into targets for industry. Industry consumes a lot of energy, a lot of its heat. Some of this could be renewable. Is anyone working on it? Is anyone talking to the firms? Is anyone trying to investigate this? Not enough's being done. This is a place where policy can come in and start a discussion. Okay? And again, for the building sector, we have up here, not enough's being done in Germany either. Germany very much has an electricity transition, not an energy transition. Now, two of the big modules that we have if we're going to switch, and I'm talking now about electricity most for the rest of the discussion today because that's all we have. Within the electricity sector, if you want to switch to renewables, there are two basic models for that. One of them is called a quota, and the other one is the feed-in tariff. The quotas are called RPSs and obligation certificate credits in the UK, RPSs in the States, renewable portfolio standards, things like that, various terms for it. And one of the, especially if you're an economist, I was told that I have a mixture here of engineers and economists. Is that true? How many of you are economists? Or more economists? Not too many, not too many. So from the economists, I often get the argument, or you often hear it, the argument that we need to allow markets to make decisions, and what Germany's doing is too expensive, okay? And they want the free market to make a decision. Sorry, this seems to have been somehow reformatted on this screen. Sorry, you can't read that. All policies are government intervention is what that says. What I mean by that is that whatever policy you take, even if you take quotas, quotas go in and say, for instance, we want to have 20% renewables by 2020. In the States, you have laws that say that a particular utility will have to participate in this. German law doesn't tell any utility that they have to participate. That's also why companies like RWE and E.ON are doing very little over here, okay? So we're hearing that quotas are free market mechanisms, but if you look at it, you see the government telling specific companies what to do. That's kind of bizarre. And the reason that this is held to be this way is that feed-in tariffs fix a price, but they leave the volume up to the market, okay? So we set a price for solar, and then solar booms. And we don't have a limit on that here. We're actually working on getting a limit for wind and solar right now. But the volume has always been left up to the market. It's the other way around with quotas. And so my argument really is that this thing that they're saying is free market, it doesn't really look like free market. The only difference is that the economists don't like, for some reason, when you say we're fixing a price. Okay, that breaks a kind of central tenet in, I would say, Anglo economics. You have it over in Germany a bit, but we're a bit freer in our thinking over here. So there are some Germans who say this is not a good idea, but actually there are a lot of economists over here who like it. Quotas tend to promote big players, whereas FITs create a bigger market. I'd like to play a game with you real quick. I'm going to come down here, and I need 3 people. I'll just take you 3. Yeah, you can sit down. You can sit down. I need a. I'm gonna have a wind farm. I'm the president of Oldenburg or something, and I'm going to have a wind farm with 100 turbines. Okay, because anything else is too small. And I've got this really great wind site. Okay. Now I need you 3. You're all different companies. Okay, you're different wind companies. I want you to think. Don't say it yet. Think about how much one wind turbine in that project is going to cost from your company. Okay? You got a number? Make it up. Pick a number. No, say yes. Pick a number. Okay, you ready? All right. So submit your bid. What does one wind turbine from your company cost?
$500,000.
$500,000.
100,000?
100,000.
200,000.
200,000. Okay. So the first thing that we learned is that you guys don't know what a wind turbine costs. A modern wind turbine, I mean, obviously there will be wind turbines that cost that much, but they will be relatively small. A wind turbine that's about 1.5 or 2.5 megawatts, which is what is built today, will cost millions of euros. Okay? So maybe a 1.5 will run you 3 or 4 million, something like that. I don't know exactly. It's hard to come by these figures, by the way. So we're about a factor of 10 below that. But that's fine. So you said 500, you said 100, you said 200,000. Who do I take? Economist?
Cheapest.
The cheapest one. Yeah, I take 100,000, right? Easy. Because assuming in the specifications for the bid that I have said we have to have certain quality criteria and all the rest, the only thing I'm judging at that point is the price. Okay. Notice that everyone else in this room did not bid. You know why? Because these guys are the big companies, and they were able to maybe send somebody out to look at the site, actually investigate the wind conditions, talk to their engineers, pick particular turbines because they have 10 that they could sell you, pick the one that they're going to actually sell you, okay? And this took a week or two of negotiations between some extremely high-paid people. We're talking tens of thousands of euros just to make an offer. And I think you won, right? So you two are bankrupt now. You're not bankrupt, but you wasted a lot of time. And so everyone is going to pass on these costs the next time we have a round of bids, okay? Eventually, I, as the government, will say, well, you know, company B here is always winning, and we're going to create a monopoly. So I, as the government, will say, okay, we're going to give it to we're going to give a little bit to these two guys just to keep them in business, because otherwise we end up with a monopoly. That happens too. So you do try to keep the market competitive as a government. But you see that this system creates losers. Okay? Now, this is the way feed-in tariffs work. We're going to pay you, let's say, 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And now all of you can, in your spare time, look up with your communities what this is going to cost, how much a turbine will cost. You can have a buddy go out and hold up one of those balloons or whatever they use to measure the wind with. And you can go by the bank, and you can do all this for 1,000 euros. And you can figure out whether you can invest at 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And maybe 70% of you will build. Okay? Now you're not all building 100 turbines. Okay? But we might get 100 this way from 70% of this group. And the other 30% are on sites that just didn't work, or maybe you'll wait. Okay? And that's the big difference. So quotas promote these big guys. All these other smaller players who don't have the resources and the expertise get shut out. Quotas also, you hear that feed-in tariffs pick winners. Actually, that's exactly what feed-in tariffs don't do. We're ramping up everything. It's true that the government decides that we want wind, solar, and biomass in the case of Germany, but that doesn't. We're providing roughly the same return on all of these. So the quotas are the ones that pick the winners, and it's usually going to be wind. I can give you an example of that. There was a recent round of tenders or requests for proposals in Brazil. It was some of the cheapest. It produced some of the cheapest wind power in the world. People are amazed at how cheap wind power is going to be in Brazil. Do you know how much solar they're building in that round of tenders? 0. Do you know how many requests, how many bids they got? 0. The solar people took a look at 4 cents per kilowatt hour and said, why bother? Now, if Brazil is serious about going largely renewable, they've got to build solar at some point. And so now they've realized what's going on, and they're having a second round just for solar. So you end up doing this anyway. You could have just saved yourself the trouble and had feed-in tariffs. But feed-in tariffs and quotas are not opposites. In effect, Germany has these targets within EU law, but it's using feed-in tariffs to get there. So you can mix them. And in general, I would say that quotas produce or allow the cheapest projects to be built, while feed-in tariffs allow everything worth doing to be built. And this is why Germany is moving quickly, and why other countries are maybe not so fast, but actually a lot of countries have feed-in tariffs. Now, how many of you don't know who feed-in tariffs, what feed-in tariffs are? Just a couple of people? Well, I'll just very briefly explain this. This is another chart from Energy Transition. Essentially, you're locked in, you're offered a rate here if you build in 2005 and connect to the grid. This is how much money you get starting that year, and you get it for 20 years. Okay? But future systems that go in will get less. So if you connect 5 years later, you will only get this much. But you will also get that for 20 years. Okay? And so the pressure is on the market to bring costs down. But at the same time, your investment, which you only made once, right? You paid $20,000 for your solar roof one time. That return is fairly safe if you get the sunlight over those 20 years. Okay? So the rates go down, but they only go down for new systems, not for existing ones. One of the big charges against feed-in tariffs is that they keep prices up too much. And this is demonstrably not true. If you take a look at these two lines, this is a German chart, the blue line is the level of feed-in tariffs. The orange line is how much systems cost. And it's based on the reference year of 2006. Okay? So they both start off equal at 2006. And what you see is that feed-in tariffs were supposed to go down 5% per year. But underneath that, the price of solar dropped through the floor. And so we had a huge gap right here where people were making quite a bit of money on their solar. So the government had to go in and say, okay, 5% per year is not going to do it. So we were reducing solar by 20% per year. Okay? The reason why this works is because these payments are not made to the companies that make solar. They're made to the people who invest. And if I go out to, if I'm a homeowner and I go out to buy some solar, I might go to 2 shops and get 2 different offers. And I'm going to compare them, and I'm going to take the offer that is probably the cheapest, although I might have other considerations. Okay? But I'm putting pressure on the market to bring prices down. So if feed-in tariffs are too high, that doesn't mean that the cost of solar for the manufacturers is too high. It means that my margin as an investor is too high. And that's the situation we have right now in Japan as well. So the reason why these markets bust is not because we're paying manufacturers too much. That's why the manufacturers are bankrupt in a lot of countries. There's been tremendous price pressure. The solar sector from China to North America to Europe is having trouble. Okay? But the investors are probably doing fairly well. Another effect of this is community ownership. As we said, in a bidding system, I would have only 3 people in this room bidding, but I might have, with feed-in tariffs, everybody at least thinking about it, and most people moving at some point. We have roughly half of the investments made in renewables in Germany have been made by individual citizens and energy co-ops. These are community groups coming together to build a biomass system or a small wind farm. We have 2 in Freiburg. One has 4 turbines, the other one has 2 turbines. Okay? A big company, they will not even bother to drop by if we're talking about such a small project. Okay? These companies are used to building 600 megawatt coal plants. They don't want to talk about a 6 megawatt wind farm. That's not their scale. The big utilities in Germany only make up about 5%. This is all utilities, 12%. The big 4 that make up 75% of the power sector make up about 5 to 7% of the investments in renewables. All right? So the energy transition in Germany is a democracy movement. And that has a couple of effects. It means that distributed power has been built, not central power. Okay? You look at the United States at the projects, and we have gigantic wind farms owned by single companies. You don't have that over here. We have much smaller wind farms, and ownership is splintered. We have gone, distributed means that we have been able to go from 3% renewable electricity in 1992 to 25% last year without upgrading the grid. Okay? You hear all this talk about, oh, Germany needs to build power lines, and everyone who knows what's going on goes, yeah, right. Okay? If you do this the right way, you don't need to build power lines as much. The whole power grid in Germany was built for the central power plants. We built power lines for nuclear and coal and gas. We don't need them as much for renewables. Also, this decreases NIMBYism because communities are able to come in and say, all right, we're going to fight this out among ourselves. You have a company come in, you see this in the States all the time. Companies come in the States and say, we're putting up 50 turbines here. And everyone goes, hell no, right? And then you get all this opposition. In Germany, some guy from the village, I mean literally some guy from the village who knows everyone in town anyway, comes in and says, hey, I'd like to put up some turbines. Can we have a town hall meeting here? And then everybody comes in, and there's 10% of the people, or maybe it's 50, or maybe it's 80, saying, I don't want them. How many are you going to put up? I don't know. Maybe, how many do you want? We don't want any. Well, okay, maybe can we put up 2? And then they fight about it. And it goes on for 2 years. Okay? But they're having a beer with their neighbors, so they do it. Companies won't do this. It's a waste of their time. And then they put up the 2 turbines, and what happens? You can't hear them, and everybody's making a 6% return. And then the people who didn't invest go, 6%? I'm getting 1% from my bank, and I just lost money on the stock market. Can we put up 2 more turbines, please? And then you get your 10 turbines. But it takes time, and you work with people. And again, this sounds like it's going slower, but actually Germany's moving so quickly that it's almost uncontrollable. Okay? But you don't end up with the NIMBYism. The question is, how do you set limits, though? This is a chart of power production across a week. And what you see here is, at the bottom, there's biomass, which runs more or less all the time. Then there's nuclear, which also, nuclear's technology, you switch it on, it runs for 18 months, then you switch it off, put some new fuel rods in, right? That's the way nuclear works. Coal is increasingly able to ramp up and down. The new coal plants in Germany ramp amazingly well. Hard coal and lignite, these things go up and down. It's unbelievable, like gas almost. And so that's what you see. Above that, the brown is lignite, the black is hard coal, the orange is natural gas, and this over here, the green is wind. Now look what happens when wind comes in. This was last month. Wind comes in on a weekend when power demand is relatively low. And you can see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the solar, right? The solar is the yellow part. You see the effect of solar. This is actually power demand going up, and solar's kind of put on top. 20 years ago, the power curve looked exactly the same because people get up and go to work, and then they have lunch, and they're cooking, and we're using electricity at noon, and then again in the evening. Those are our 2 peaks during the day, around 12 o'clock and around 8 o'clock. And solar comes in and wipes out one of those peaks. So just imagine all of this capacity used to have to go up to the top of solar, and now it never goes there anymore. It never has to. And then something happens over here where we just get wind coming in at a tremendous level. This is a really weak wind week until we hit the weekend. And then look what the effect is on all of this base load capacity. We don't even have medium load capacity in Germany anymore, hardly. It's almost all renewables and base load. And look what happens when we get a good peak here. You're going to have to ramp down nuclear. Hard coal is almost gone, and brown coal is cut in half. Power companies don't like this. This cuts into their profits. And so what you have is an issue that no one's talking about, but it comes before storage. Everyone asks me, okay, Craig, you think Germany's going to go renewable and all that, but you don't have a storage solution, do you? And I say, no, but we don't have a storage problem either. You go back to this chart and look how far away we are from having 100% renewables ever. Even on that weekend, we've only got 50% renewables. I think the record is about 60%. So we're a long way from having 100% renewables at any particular time where we would need to store power. What we need to store is the combination of renewables and baseload. We need to store nuclear power. We need to store the mixture of nuclear and coal and renewables. That's what we need to store. And if you look at when solar is going to, when renewables are going to require storage, you end up with some interesting figures. Now these charts are hard to understand, so bear with me. We'll look at this one first. The first thing that I need to point out as well is where we go down. You can see that at about 20, we go down into the 30s here for 30 gigawatts over here, 30,000 megawatts. By the end of the weekend, we're at about 30,000, but the plants like to be in the 40s and 50s, right? The baseload plants. They like to be up around 40 gigawatts. If they get pushed down into the 30s, we start to get negative prices at about 30 gigawatts or below 30 gigawatts. I've seen it go down to 24 gigawatts, and we had severely negative prices. The companies don't want to ramp down that far. They will pay you to take power off their hands so they don't have to shut down their plants anymore. Okay? The limit is about 20. Technically, the limit is 20. Financially, the limit's about 25. But technically, the limit's about 20. And this is based on that idea of 20 gigawatts of must-run capacity. Okay? Germany now has about 35 gigawatts of wind and about 35 gigawatts of solar. That means that we can use about 100% of our electricity without needing to store it. If we build this up, if we double the amount of wind and more than double the amount of solar, we will still only need to store 1%. We can directly use 99%. Okay? That's if we double everything we have now. So storage, don't even worry about it. What we need to store is not renewables. What we need to store, if anything, is the combination of baseload and renewables. Look at what happens over here if you reduce the must-run from 20 to 5. If you get rid of this baseload capacity and replace it with something that ramps up and down, suddenly this 1% moves from this bar all the way up to here. We're talking about not something like 60 gigawatts of wind, but now we're up at nearly 100. Okay? So what we need to do to solve the storage problem is not change what we're doing with renewables. It's get rid of power plants that don't go up and down. They have to go up and down every day. You follow me? Okay. I'm going to show you another chart on this in just a second, and it might make more sense. So, let's see, how am I doing on time? I think I need to speed up a little bit. I'll skip a little bit here so we can see what's happening. This is related to the merit order. Is the merit order a term? How many of you know the merit order? Okay, then I'll explain it. The merit order is, that's what this slide was about. This is an energy-only market, okay? There are different services that power plants provide. Two basic ones. One of them is just the kilowatt hour that you can use to run the projector up there, right? The other one is grid services, stabilizing the grid, just having the power plant ready to go when you need it, okay? If a power plant is sitting there not running and you have an energy-only market, then you're not getting paid anything, but you're still providing a service. You're ready to go. And that's kind of what we don't have on an energy-only market based on the merit order. We don't have necessarily proper compensation for these other services, the grid reliability services. We pay only for the energy. And so this is fuel prices, okay? So it's not how much a nuclear plant costs, it's how much nuclear fuel costs. And nuclear fuel costs very, very little. And so the first thing you do is use nuclear plants. Then you switch on, in Germany, you switch on your lignite, and then you switch on your hard coal. This is just what we saw in that weekly depiction, except it was stacked up this way, now it's lying down. And so the more power you use, the more you cut into hard coal, the more you cut into natural gas. And the way renewables work is they push from this side here, okay? And they mean that you can sort of subtract the renewables from the power that you need from conventional plants. All right? Now the merit order is different in different countries because the price of fuel is different. So in the UK, We have a difference with natural gas. This is CCGT and OCGT. These are two types of gas turbines. Natural gas is very expensive in Germany, but it's relatively cheap in the UK because they produce some of it themselves. And what happens though is in the winter, this flips around because the British are also using natural gas for heat. And so the price of gas then goes up in the winter, and that will switch around. Okay? So this is the way most Western markets, the United States, the UK, this is what we've switched to recently. And the problem with this for renewables is that wind and solar don't have a fuel price. So their fuel price is zero. So in a way, they don't have a place on this market. And so you have to start thinking about how you're going to pay for something that has no fuel price on a market based completely on fuel price. And this market was set up, these market ideas were set up in the 1990s when the world, buried communism and decided that markets were the way things were going to be. We didn't really see renewables coming back then, I guess. This chart really expresses well this idea of early retirement and the problem that we have with inflexible power plants. This is a week in 2012. Okay, we just saw a chart like this, so you have a rough idea of what this is. If we just take the growth that we had then and say 10 years later, actually it's not even, it's only 8 years later from 2012, it's 6 years from now. This is what Germany could look like in 6 years if we don't do something. If we don't slow down renewables, for instance. Okay? We are going to have 6 days out of the week, we're going to basically wipe out baseload, but for a very short time. And then we're going to need it back. Look at this. Look how that goes up right there. What is that, 70, 60? That's practically all of our electricity is going to have to come from these power plants that are not running enough hours to be profitable because we're wiping them out. And technically, they can't even do it. Too many of our power plants are too old, and they're not able to shut down and ramp up again in a day. Nuclear doesn't do that at all. Our old coal plants can't do it. So this is a big problem. And this might be one reason why the government is saying, without really saying it, they're not going to come out and say it, but they might be saying among themselves, can we figure out some way to slow this down without making everybody mad at us? Because the transition is very popular. And what's happening among institutional investors is they are seeing their plants run for fewer and fewer hours, become less and less profitable. And so these are the plans from year to year, right? So in April 2010, they have to report their power plant construction plans to the network agency. And this is what they were planning. And only a year later it went down, and then a year later it went down, and it's still going down. We have lost about 10 gigawatts, or maybe it's 8 gigawatts of plans just in the past few years. In other words, the companies are trying to stop every project they can because everything is unprofitable right now. Okay? The problem is we might end up not having the power generation capacity to keep the lights on. I hate to use that phrase because that's what we were told in the 1970s. If you switch off nuclear, the lights are going to go out. Well, we're now hearing that from some people in the renewables sector who are saying, okay, this could be a problem. By the time we finish the nuclear phase out, we're switching off a lot, we're not building enough up, and it's not necessarily going to ramp enough. So our policies have to focus on what is needed in the long term. So kilowatt hours are not everything. There are these grid stability services. They're called ancillary services in the States. Dispatchability is an issue, whether you can switch on a plant or not. In a way, the coal and nuclear plants, the old ones, are not really that dispatchable. You switch them on, and then they like to stay on. That's not really dispatchable either. But if we try to fix the problem, there's a risk of saving conventional plants. How do you fix this problem? You throw money at the coal plants. Wow, Germany's going to be really popular when they do that, right? oh, you guys built all this renewables and then you threw money at your coal plants because we told you renewables wouldn't work anyway, right? Okay, so this is going to make Germany really popular if they do that. Now there are some ways around this. There are different ways of financing this dispatchable capacity. And it doesn't have to all be generation capacity. One way is demand response. So you can pay people to stop using power. You could have every refrigerator in Germany receive a signal and switch off for 2 hours. And that would actually be that's a couple of gigawatts right there for the country as a whole. You'd be surprised what you can do with cooling and freezing, okay? I've been saying this for about 12 years and nothing has happened. We're so late on this. But this needs to be done. And that's something that would be good for the future. And it's not paying for coal plants. Storage is something that we could talk about. And another thing you could talk about is if you're going to pay for this backup capacity that's not running enough to be profitable, maybe you could pay based on carbon content. Okay, so if your carbon content is high, you don't get much money. That would be giving more money to gas plants. It would help Germany stay within its carbon emissions scheme or carbon emissions targets. So we need policies that will help us. This is outside of renewables. We need policies that will help us shift from coal to gas for the emissions. We need somehow, in addition to renewable policies for renewable energy, we need some kind of policies for efficiency. Germany's got to do more here, but Germany's not alone there. Too many countries are just not really focusing on efficiency, which everyone agrees is the biggest source of energy, just not using it. Demand side management is DSM, just talked about that, and then conservation or sufficiency. Can anyone define sufficiency for me? Have you got an idea of what that is? You have a smile on your face, you know what it is? Yeah? No, the guy in the white shirt. Yeah?
Well, sufficiency is, well, the ability to be happy with what one has. So it's kind of, yeah, not using too much. Yeah.
Okay, so here's the policy. I'm the president of Oldenburg, and I now mandate that you are all happy with what you have. Now that is the idea of sufficiency, but how do you put that into a policy? The idea of sufficiency is that it's not quite producing renewables or green energy, and it's not really efficiency either, in the sense that efficiency really is some device or some process producing the same output or product with less input energy. Can anyone think of an example of sufficiency? What could you promote?
Biking.
Biking. That's exactly the example I was going to give. Cycling. And here Germany's done a really terrible job in a way. I mean, it's done a mixed job. Some cities are doing pretty well on building bike lanes. That's something you can do as a policymaker, build bike lanes. If you wanted to encourage people not to fly all the time, you could make bicycle holidays more practical. The problem is that Germany has focused on building high-speed trains. And so if you wanted people to switch, there used to be a train that went from Freiburg, where I live, up to Cologne, and there was a whole car where you could just stuff bikes in, and that train no longer exists. And nowadays, if you want to have a train like that, you have to change trains about every hour, or maybe it's 2 hours in some spots. So the combination of trains and bikes in Germany has really worsened since I have been here, since I got here. But that's the kind of thing you could do. You could promote policies that will encourage people to do the right thing. Okay? That's what sufficiency is about. Finally, another big policy that accompanies renewables is emissions trading. And this has not worked. You studied this a little bit or not? No, not really? Okay. Well, you know what it is, right? It's you have to pay for, if you want to emit carbon, you have to pay, you have to buy allowances. And partly because of the economic crisis, industry slowed down, and so there wasn't any demand. And that's the second bit. This is the economic crisis tip. But there was this dip before. This was the first phase, this is the second phase. Right now, in the beginning, we simply gave out too many. And then we realized, okay, that was too much, and that didn't work. And now prices have gone down even further. This looks like they're about 17 euros per ton. They're actually now at 7, something like that. They were down at 5 just a couple of months ago. The price that we wanted to have to get something done was about 30, and some people hoped it would reach 50. And it didn't work. Okay? So that has been really ineffective. And the problem is now that we can't change it because this is a legal contract with the companies. We cannot change it until 2020, so we're stuck. We're stuck with an inefficient system for the next 6 years. If you're designing emissions trading, then you want to make sure that you are able to flexibly react. So don't enter these 8-year periods. You might have a financial crisis, you might have something else happen. You'll want to be able to change every year or two and review, just like we review feed-in tariffs, right? We review those every year or two. But we didn't do that with emissions trading. The other thing is, what does emissions trading cover? Emissions trading basically covers in Europe the power sector and aviation. It doesn't cover transportation, and it doesn't cover agriculture. 2 big areas. So it's actually not complete at all. A better way of doing this would be a carbon tax. In every way it would be better. You don't need all of these experts, once again, right? You have all kinds of financial experts making a lot of money on carbon trading, even though it's ineffective. Now this adds administrative costs to the system. A carbon tax has almost no administrative costs. You just tag it on, and you could put it on everything. You put it on oil, and bam, you've covered the transportation sector, which emissions trading doesn't do. You could cover agriculture, all right? So it would be better in both of those ways, and it's harder to game. In other words, well, let me just give you the next quote, basically. This is from a recent article, and again, I say this, I don't want to sound too negative about emissions trading. If we could get it to work, I would love to have it, okay? But I'm pleading not to completely throw it out because it doesn't work. I'm pleading to either fix it or just do something better, which I think would be carbon taxation, okay? But this was a wonderful article recently. In practice, the same industries and governments that supported an ETS-driven policy, that's the emissions trading scheme, the ones that supported this before 2030 would likely abandon it. It's a con trick. They pretend to support a target for 2030 knowing full well that they will get loopholes in it for carbon leakage, which dilute it to little more than business as usual. So why do we have emissions trading? We have emissions trading because we know it won't work. There are ways of making emissions trading work, and you won't like them because they are fair. I can make this globally fair. We can make this globally fair. All right? We've got all this discussion about China and the US and different levels. Okay, fine. Why don't we say per capita? Everybody has a right to a per capita amount of carbon emissions. All right? And if you're in Africa or something and you don't have as much, maybe you can grow a little. And the Americans and the Europeans have to come down. And then we will all meet. These are 2 charts essentially. This chart shows how much we would be emitting. And this kind of breaks it down and says in 2030 we could have a meeting point. And everybody has to draw towards that meeting point. And in 2030 we have per capita emissions. And from then on we keep drawing the line down and it affects everybody. And that's the end of the story. This will not even be discussed. Okay? Angela Merkel said when she was environmental minister, she said she liked the idea of cap and converge, which is what this is called. You won't find this discussed. Nobody's taking this seriously. Why not? Because it will work and it's fair and it would radically change everyone's lives. Man, you wouldn't be flying anywhere at that point. You're not going to fly home at all. You're cycling to wherever you're from. Okay? I'm cycling back to New Orleans. Okay? They're going to have to build that bridge. Whoops. So there are actually fair ways of doing this. Finally, I'm actually in time. Finally, when you're talking about targets, make a distinction between clean energy and what else do we have? Decarbonization in the UK. There's different ways of talking about it. The UK likes to talk about decarbonization because they want to include nuclear. Clean technology, if you hear about clean energy, if you look at things like the Pew report on clean energy, look and see whether they're including something called clean coal. Don't even get me started on clean coal, that's a different hour. But if you want to target on renewables, make sure you call it renewables. Anything else is, if anybody has a target for anything other than something called renewables, they're sneaking something in. The Dutch also have a target for 100% sustainable. I haven't met a Dutchman yet who knows what that is. Why are you calling it sustainable? I don't know. Where's the government document that defines it? We don't have one. We only have documents that say we want to be 100% sustainable by 2050. So, to wrap this up, my main takeaways that I would suggest is that, first of all, policies are needed. Okay? There are things that governments can do to help facilitate change. Targets are kind of, yeah, 2020 by 2020, okay, fine. But they do serve a purpose. They start a discussion, and they start people collecting data. That's worthwhile. The incumbents on the market are not going to do this because it's not in their interest. So please don't ask your big companies to do this. Just act like they're not there. Okay? They will push back at some point, but you can get going for a long, long time. And by the time, based on the German example at least, by the time they wake up and realize that this is going to hurt them, it'll probably be too late for them to stop it. Solar and wind, especially, require a different power market. Biomass can be switched on and off. To some extent, hydropower, whatever else you have. Maybe we're going to have geothermal. If you're from the Philippines, maybe you have that. But wind and solar are not dispatchable. You can't switch them on and off. They cannot react to prices. If prices are low, you can't say, oh, can you get that wind turbine going? It's not the way it works. So that needs a different market. Make sure that you stress that and insist on that. We need a bouquet. We do not need to focus on the cheapest kilowatt hour. We need to focus on what's needed for the entire transition. So you need to think about how much wind might we need, how much solar might we need, what else do we need, what else do we have. Germany doesn't have geothermal. A lot of countries do. Okay, just to give one example. The British might be developing marine power right now. We're not they're doing some things, and it might work, but it might not. So that might be another big player by 2030, who knows? But leave it open and don't focus on the cheapest thing. Early retirement precedes storage, and this is where your companies are going to push back. So don't even enter this. The answer to what are you going to do about storage is, I don't know, we'll figure it out when we get there, and I don't see that coming. Don't forget heat and transport, which is what we haven't talked about today either. I have given you nothing on those sectors, just because I'm trying to talk about what's actually happening. But if you want to work on a transition, focus on those sectors. And finally, I'd like to toss out an idea that maybe there is a right to make your own energy. Maybe there's a civil right, maybe there's a human right to make your own energy. And when the established companies and politicians start pushing back and saying, okay, we don't need your solar now. This is happening in Arizona, Hawaii, Australia, Austria, Germany, probably all kinds of other places. There's a big pushback now saying, okay, you can stop now. I think we do need to talk about targets and limits and how much we need, but remember that you have a right to grow your own fruit. If you have a fruit tree, they don't tax your fruit. And they don't come and tell you, oh, but you're raising the cost of the infrastructure because fewer people are going to the grocery store. Right? The grocery store is selling less. So you have to pay more just to go buy there. We should charge, you have a fruit tree, we should charge you an admission to go to the grocery store. That's what they're doing. with renewables now. So start thinking about that. Ask yourself whether people have a right to make their own energy and whether we would all benefit from a realization of that. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for this really interesting talk. We are going to have some questions.
Great.
Okay, it's me, Philip. Thank you very much for the nice presentation. I'm studying a program called Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency for the MENA region. It's a cooperation between the University of Kassel in Germany and Cairo University in Egypt. I also brought some colleagues of my group.
I think I've read about that, yeah.
Yeah, and actually you helped us a lot with your reports because we always had to address Germany as a pioneer in renewable energy and energy transition, and you have that holistic view as also today. That it's not just a good example, but also sometimes a bit, there's a lobbying going on and so on. And I also read another book from Claudia Kempfer, you might know her.
I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, she wrote the book Fight for Electricity, Come from Strom. And she addresses the question if the energy transition in Germany is really manageable. And she comes to the conclusion that it is definitely, at least theoretically, but there are some forces that are working against it. And she says the next 10 years will decide about our energy future. And it's all about that energy utilities that try to implement more coal-fired power plants than needed. And if they manage it, if they are really successful in that not really sustainable coal-fired power plants, then we don't have that many arguments for renewable energies. So I just want to ask you that question. Right now it's quite clear that they made their aim, they built up many new coal-fired power plants. So do we still have that argument for renewable energy in Germany?
So it's essentially the question is, are the companies building up all of this capacity so that they can then say, okay, we don't need your stuff now, right? I mean, in a way, you can always say the next 10 years will be crucial. I'm sure that in the 1990s, everyone was saying the next 10 years will be crucial. The next 10 years from now will absolutely be crucial. There's no doubt about it. There's two ways of looking at it. I mean, in a way, I get asked all the time, if Germany's so great with renewables, why are they building all these coal plants? And I have to explain to them, you'd be surprised, but there are actually different forces at work in Germany. The government doesn't decide everything. This is like news to Americans who think that we're Stalinist or something. But they think that the government decides all of these things. And I have to explain to them that the coal plants were planned at the beginning of that emissions trading, the first phase of that, where they saw the prices were low for carbon, and they said, okay, we can go for coal. Right? We've got all these old plants, let's replace it with coal. If you had said at a board meeting back then, we're supposed to go renewables, they would have said, yeah, but renewables don't work, do they? I can't switch on a turbine. I can't switch on solar. End of discussion. Okay? That's the way the discussions would have run. And so we're getting this coal now as a result of this old stuff. But what I see happening is the conventional sector backing out. This is what we want them to do. We want them not to build so that they come at us and say, okay, we're full now. Thank you very much. We don't need anything from you anymore. At the same time, even if they did that, renewables have priority on the grid. This is the second big part of feed-in tariffs. It's not just the price. It's the fact that renewables have to be bought. They have to offset your other capacity. So everything else gets ramped down. If we can defend that, then it doesn't matter. If we defend that, then all of these companies will go bankrupt. I don't know that we want them to go bankrupt. I think a lot of people in the renewables community want them to go bankrupt, okay, for obvious reasons. I'm not sure that we want them to go bankrupt because we do need, I mean, 80% renewable electricity in 2050 means 20% fossil, okay? So we will have fossil. We don't have a 100% target. If we just take our target seriously for the moment. So that's the situation I see. You could, if you can defend the right to renewable priority on the grid, then it doesn't matter what they build. but then they're going to go bankrupt fast, and then we might have to bail them out. Or we let them go, and then I don't see how we're going to, I'm not saying we can't do it, I'm saying we don't have a clear mechanism right now to replace them. What it's going to lead to is some kind of government takeover one way or the other. That's what I see coming.
Okay, next question.
I have two questions. Once regarding Freiburg. I lived there for years. I don't live there anymore, but I saw that there's two wind farms, like one with 4 wind turbines and one with 2. They exist there for many years, but if they were so successful, I would have expected that there would have been more such wind, like community-owned wind turbines. Why they don't exist there? And the second question is, you are suggesting to have a separate market for solar and wind. So I don't know, like what is your market design for such markets?
The first question, the reason why we don't have more turbines within the city limits is because the city limits are, it's within the city. Now, we could put a couple more up on another mountain, but there is a kind of Burgfrieden. People have, the movement has sort of stopped where it is because the fight stopped. And I think also one problem is those particular projects might not be so profitable. We've actually had lower wind conditions than was expected 10 years ago. And so the question is whether anything new that gets put up will be profitable, and if it's going to stir up the nest again and get the debate going. However, you leave the city limits, and there's a lot going in the Black Forest. If you, I don't know when you were there last, but if you drive around today,
September.
okay, well drive around behind Hinterzarten and go up, and you'll see, go to Kandel, and go to the big mountain and look towards the east, and you'll see quite a few turbines have gone up. If you were there 10 years ago, let's say, those weren't there. So things are going up elsewhere, but Freiburg is a city, so it's got very limited, actually, wind resources. Your other question was?
What's the market design for?
What do I suggest? I actually suggest keeping feed-in tariffs. That was the slide that I skipped because I felt like I was running out of time. I suggest keeping feed-in tariffs because I don't think they're a startup mechanism. I hear all this talk about feed-in tariffs were great in the beginning, but now blah, blah, blah. And I think, well, if you're going to have renewables that are intermittent like this, you're going to have to, if a lot of wind power is produced, okay? So this chart, the wind power goes up, okay? You've got more supply. What happens to prices on the market? Prices go down.
Negative.
They might even be negative. So right when I produce a lot of solar and wind, the prices are going to be down. How am I supposed to finance something like that? That is not going to work. Now, I am in favor of changing feed-in tariffs to, or tweaking them so that they produce different outcomes. For instance, to reduce the amount of storage that we might eventually need, we might not want to have everything facing the sun, everything facing directly south. If you build more stuff facing slightly east and west, the peak is flattened out over the day. So you don't have a high peak for 1 hour, you have a lower peak for 4 hours. We don't have, feed-in tariffs do not provide any kind of compensation for that. There's no price signal for that, okay? There's no price signal for wind turbines. We're now building larger rotors and keeping the generator the same size. This means that the wind turbine runs more hours, but it never produces more electricity than 2.5 megawatts, let's say. All right? So you could put a 5 megawatt turbine there, and it would run half the time and produce the same amount of power. Or you could do it the way we're now talking, keep the generator size, make the rotors bigger, make the tower taller, and you get this, a smaller amount of electricity over more hours. There's no mechanism for that. There's no compensation to encourage that. So we can start thinking about ways of tweaking it, but I think we need some kind of energy-only market for conventional and also biomass, anything that ramps. We need that market for dispatchable that can react to prices. maybe tweaked feed-in tariffs of some sort for wind and solar. And then we can talk about whether we need a capacity market, which will pay plants just for being ready, just to keep them profitable. Okay? So maybe a mixture like that. Yes?
So I totally agree with you that there is an absence of markets to allow the best ideas to compete and come out and emerge. And so, like, maybe another way to do it is to kind of change the current energy market. Instead of selling electrons to consumers, we sell the electric services, energy services. And you're from New Orleans, right? I'm surprised that you don't want the fossil fuel industries to get bankrupt, because I formerly worked for Halliburton, and the EP.
You used to work for Halliburton?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, you have to, look, if they go bankrupt, it doesn't mean that the fossil fuel industry just collapses. The infrastructure is still there, the factories, the coal seams, they're all there. Like telecom communication companies, the telecommunication companies, they can go bankrupt, but we can still have our cell phone services. It's just, that the idea, that profit-making business model idea is weeded out in the evolutionary chain of society.
Okay, a part of me wants these companies to go bankrupt, don't get me wrong. The thing, I mean, I'm also noticing that I have been over here so long that I'm not even thinking about Halliburton. I'm thinking of RWE and E.ON and the big guys over here, Vattenfall. In general, the problem with corporations as a business model is that they serve their shareholders and they have quarterly reports. And so no long-term vision is even possible. I think this is probably just a bad business model. I think the entire stock market is just a bad idea. Okay, so we could get rid of the entire business model of corporations with some exceptions. Corporations were invented for a reason hundreds of years ago. There were some projects that were really, really big, and this was one way of doing it. But I recently wrote that there was a tweet, back to the tweets, there was a tweet that someone wrote that said, if all these guys who are, bashing corporations would just start using a homegrown cell phone, right? You're using Apple or Samsung or something. It's a corporation. And I wrote back, I didn't write back, I thought about it, and I wrote a post about it at Energy Transition, and I said, that's interesting because there are we're probably not going to have, homegrown cell phones. But maybe the energy market is different, and maybe the energy market naturally trends towards community power and energy democracy, if we let it. So maybe we are artificially propping up the corporations in the energy sector, and we could do this without them. And maybe that's not true for, tablets. Just a thought. I haven't made up my mind on it yet. I don't know. Maybe, how do you feel about it?
3D printers.
Okay. See, he's ahead of me. I knew that.
I have a question. So for the plastic show with the...
Maybe you can take a mic. I think.
I got one. Okay. For the plots showing the total energy generation in Germany, so they show the total energy generation in Germany, but not really the local generation share and the transient effects of a very variable energy source. So we can see like an average out over like an hour or something. It's a nice smooth curve. But if you look at like a millisecond and second interval, you got like lines going everywhere. And so that it looks like that if you have a infinite transmission line, it would all be like one grid. But you said you don't need transmission. So I'm just wondering, how well does it really represent the actual situation, showing all of Germany together in one plot instead of, because in some it's very localized. Yeah, the transmission is limited.
Right, so you're saying basically the resolution that we had on the weekly chart was such that everything looks nice and smooth.
The resolution, yeah, time resolution and spatial.
Yeah, geographical, yeah. This is a good point. Obviously, a lot of the transmission issues in Germany are actually not on the transmission level, they're on the distributed level. So you have some fairly rural areas, farming communities in Allgäu in southern Germany, where all the farmers with relatively low power consumption, so they haven't had huge lines built to them. But they're building a lot of solar on their barns, which have very large roofs. And so a lot of the issues we are having are on the distributed grid level. I've seen, you can look at these minute resolution things and you see a lot more spikes. But taken as a country, these things tend to flatten out. I mean, wind turbines don't flicker across the country, right? And actually, and yet, Germany has the most reliable grid in the OECD. And for the other countries, we just don't have the data. The only place that has a better grid than Germany is Singapore. That's a city-state. Germany has 14 minutes of downtime. We have a chart about this on energy transition if you want to take a look at it. This is data from CEER. It's the European kind of grid regulator network. And the second country is Denmark. Guess what? Denmark has days, they had a day in October where they had more than 100% wind. So you, sorry?
121%.
121%. They regularly have 80%, okay? This is a small country, they're very well integrated, but they're also neighboring Germany, and when they have a lot of wind, we have a lot of wind. So I think this is probably, are you like a grid guy?
I work in microgrids.
Okay.
So remote wind diesel grids and stuff. And so, I mean, in that situation, it's everyone's working together. You have wind power, diesel generators, geothermal, whatever, and they're all trying to make it work economically and technically, right? And so, and it is a huge challenge when you have, like, because the diesel generators do have, like, a limit how low they can go.
Yeah.
And everything kind of works together, and it is a huge challenge for these small grids to integrate at high penetration.
Yeah, even, I mean, you say it very well, even the diesel generators have a limit to how low they can go. All right, that's what I'm talking about when we have the storage charts next to each other, right? You've got to reduce the amount that the power plants have to produce if you want to switch to this variable stuff. I mean, the people you want to work with are at Fraunhofer in Freiburg, Bruno Burger, and they also produce they are the ones who produce that weekly chart. They have, I've stood in the facility. It's bigger than this room. They have they simulate grid fluctuations and test like at high voltage, at like the kilovolt something level. I forget how many kilovolts it is, but at some kind of kilovolt level for the grid, they will stand there in this room and short circuit at that voltage and try to test whether the equipment, which is something bigger than that piano, right? Some kind of device that's going to block that's going to protect the rest of the equipment. That's what they're testing in there, okay? So we are on this. The renewables community is on this. And I see just in the fact that the German grid is so reliable, I have great confidence without having your expertise. I don't even have that. I certainly don't have Bruno's. But everyone tells me that they're going to figure this out, so I'm confident. But I'm more of a policy guy, so.
I have a question over
Good morning, my name is Augusto Bustamante. I am following you on Twitter, and I also think it's a really useful tool.
Okay.
I'm from Ecuador, and I actually have a different perspective for the energy Wende, because our system is public. Then the government decides how many hydropower, how many wind farms they will construct, and actually in 2 years we will reach 91% of our electricity mix will be renewable, and just 10% coming from oil or gas. The question is, do you think if the energy system in Germany which was privatized in 1997 for the four companies, the big four companies. Do you think if if this electric system is public, the energy value will be easy to reach? Because as Philip said, there are other forces like the lobby forces, the nuclear, the coal, the gas forces acting on it. Do you think? What do you think?
I would just want to comment on one thing that you said before I answer. We actually have always had private companies. What happened in 1998 was not that the grid was privatized, it was that the market was deregulated. So what we used to have was what we have in the States, which is private monopolies, because the grid and power services is considered what's called a natural monopoly. So you don't want to build up power lines next to each other just so companies can compete. We deregulated that, or it's actually called liberalized it here in Europe. It's slightly different than deregulation in the States. But we've always had private companies. In fact, as a student of history, I learned that the reason Germany has that system is because after the war, the Americans and the British imposed it on them. So the Germans have an Anglo-style pro-market power sector that they've inherited. So we liberalized it, meaning that these companies now, below the transmission grid level, they have to compete for customers. I mean, I think that, to answer your question now, that's kind of what I was getting at when I answered your question about we're leading to monopolies. The way out of this is probably to bail someone out. Let some companies go bankrupt, bail the others out, maybe the government takes things over. The problem with this is that the German mindset, not all Germans like the idea. The Danes did it. The Danes nationalized their grid a decade ago. And when they did that, the discussion here was, we're going to have to do that too, aren't we? But you can see, regardless of what I think about it, it's probably more interesting to know what the Germans think about it. It's a hard sell here, because a lot of people are wedded to the idea that you set up rules, the government sets up rules, and then the companies figure it out. Okay? And a lot of people, even in the renewable sector, believe that because they were allowed to use it to build their turbines. Okay, all this turbine development that we had here, that wasn't, in the States we gave a lot of R&D money to the aerospace industry. And they built wings that were really aerodynamic and turbines that didn't work. And in Germany, they didn't give anything to anybody except feed-in tariffs. And so farmers who knew how to run a tractor, a thing that would run for 50 years, all right, it wasn't aerodynamic, but that thing didn't break. They built stuff that didn't break. And that's how everything got going over here. And so you have, within the CDU, the Christian Democrats, very much this idea that we set some rules, but the markets make the actual decisions within the rules that we give them. But even within the Greens, everyone remembers how all this got started. And so the idea of just saying, okay, the government will fix it, hard sell in Germany for that reason. I sympathize with your idea, hard sell here.
Is that a question about the fact that large industrial consumers, they don't have to pay this renewable energy fee, according to the EEG, that household consumers have to pay? What do you think about that? Is that not unfair, and would not there be much more money for renewable energies and the incentives if they would also pay?
So you're talking about the industry exemptions?
Yeah.
I would point out that that exemption has always been there. It was there in 2000. It's an idea from the Social Democrats and the Greens under, Gerhard Schröder and Fischer. It was much more restricted back then. And the justification for it is that you don't want to scare away all of your companies that can't afford this. Some companies have like 40 or 50% of their expenses are energy. You raise the price for them, they're gone. Now there are other people who say, well, maybe they should go somewhere where the energy is cheap. Why do we have to produce aluminum in Germany? Why don't they go to Iceland or Sweden or wherever it's cheap? Okay? We're just losing a couple of firms. So there's a debate about that. I don't have a clear opinion on it. I think we definitely need to reduce the number, but I don't think anybody disagrees with that, except, of course, the people who are implementing the laws. But there is a justification for that, and I see that justification. But you will end up scaring away a small number of companies. So that's a decision you have to make as a society. Can we afford to do that?
You have time for 2 more questions?
Not so much, I don't have so much about renewables, but I'm coming from economic point of view in terms of policy. Your policies seem to be mostly tailored policies in terms of, for this case, for both countries like Germany. For an economist, if you talk about the emission trading or carbon tax or other things, in today's economic world, where the whole market is globalized with big companies, of course we have all these organizations like WTO, which we have always had problems with, especially for developing countries in terms when we are telling our policies. To cut the story short, I talked about the targets, long-term targets, and now in developing countries, we are talking about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Goal number 7 is environmental sustainability. Of course, renewable energies or all other things go along with that. So, my question to you is, do you think the policies, for example, what you've given us, are just enough to bring a kind of order or to introduce maybe all of us go along with sustainability and all that sustainable growth? Because if you look at most of the laws, international laws that we have, they are just prepositions. If you look at the UN, the precautionary principles or the polluter paying principle, they are all just prepositions. At the end of the day, each country has to design its own policy. So how do you do? What is your idea?
Absolutely. I think that as someone who obviously supports feed-in tariffs, I do think they are applicable worldwide. Otherwise, I wouldn't talk about them so much. And Americans do usually say, because they don't have them, they say, oh, it won't work here. And then I say, yeah, explain that. I don't buy that particular argument. For developing countries, obviously the situation is different than in Germany. I would point out that the cost debate, for instance, if you're talking about Germany, it's going to be different for everyone else going forwards because the cost issue in Germany is only solar, almost entirely, okay? And solar's cheap now, okay? Germany built a lot of solar when it was expensive. So get beyond that concern if you're from another country and you're just getting started. The fact that it's expensive in Germany is not going to be a problem going forwards for other places. Otherwise, in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, actually the organization you want to link up with is IRENA, because they are working with, the Millennium Development Goals do not have an energy component. So Ban Ki-moon has said we want to have C for all, we want to add clean energy efficiency and energy access for all to this Millennium Goal idea. And that's specifically what IRENA is working on. And of course you have much different, as soon as you talk about energy access to people who don't have access to modern energy, a completely different discussion than what I've talked about today. And I'm really not an expert on that, but they've got plenty of people there who are very knowledgeable about it. Obviously, you have to take, going from Germany to Korea, you have to change. Going to Zimbabwe, you have to change, wherever. this is not one recipe fits all.
Okay, the last question is here.
Early last year, actually, I spent a couple of months in United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, the mother organization responsible for this emission trading scheme and all, the relevant stuff. I really, got the insight into the whole of this process and business, especially this emission trading scheme and the complex mechanism they have created out of it and the financial experts they need, that kind of stuff. The point is, even at some point while discussing with a senior official there, I said, if climate change is seriously a problem, a scheme like this would not have come at all. But he was upset about my statement, but that's a different story. But the point is, compared to this, the carbon tax appears to be more straightforward and effective. But why do most of the industrialized countries, at least serious countries like Germany, are not discussing about this carbon tax in a big way?
So why isn't Germany pushing emissions trading more?
Yeah.
You know what Germany has done, again, there are different players in Germany, and that's what I said before when people say, well, why is Germany building coal? Well, it's not the renewables sector that's building coal. It's the companies that don't believe renewables will work. The German government does a lot of things to protect its industry. You just mentioned the industry exemptions for the charge to cover the cost of renewable power. Heavy industry doesn't pay it here. What about all the things that we've had, the discussions about cars? The French wanted to have stricter emission standards for cars because their car companies can do that. The Germans build luxury cars and they don't want to mess with it. The German government bows down and gives in. And what we don't have in those sectors and what we don't have in emissions trading is this kind of grassroots, bottom-up movement that has some kind of interest there to defend, right? So the Germans are like, yeah, okay, we'll buy whatever cars we can get. I can buy the French car if I want. So what difference does it make? People don't take to the streets to oppose that. If you change the rules for wind turbines, people take to the streets because they want to build wind turbines or solar, right? But so the government goes in to protect its big companies in Germany, and there's not a democracy movement that sees its interests threatened so much that they will do something against it, take to the streets, protest. So it's an easy win for the government, easy win for the industry.
Yeah, but you think like in future they take it seriously, or do you see anything going on in this direction? Pushing this carbon tax?
We have to fight for it. I don't think this is going to happen on its own. And honestly, I think Germany is going to need help. We're going to need pressure from other countries. I don't see the German population pushing for it enough, but I think that other countries might. Pressure from France, pressure from other, maybe Spain, I don't know. Other countries with different industries might push differently, and maybe we can force Germany into a position where they have to give in. I don't see that coming from within Germany.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
One last.
Sure.
One last. While the discussion came to a different direction, that's why I want to also mention, as you said, you're a policy guy, the international certification mechanisms like joint implementation and CDM, and also sort of a clean development mechanism that allows cap and trade system for a lot of countries. I want to get a little bit more information about you. What's your opinion about that, and why do those systems not work? If they work, and for me, in my opinion, they do not work because of the, as you just showed, the price decrease in per ton of CO2 emissions. So is it something that I also want to know your opinion?
Right, so does everyone know what the CDM is, Clean Development Mechanism? If you want me to explain it briefly, essentially there's this idea in emissions trading that I could emit something at home, or I could reduce my emissions, but maybe I already have a plant that is very modern, so reducing emissions more is going to be really expensive for me. But maybe I could invest in a plant somewhere else in some other country, in Ukraine, in South Africa, wherever. And if I make that investment, which is very small compared to what I have to do here, I have the same outcome, so it's cheaper. Now this is the idea behind this kind of clean development mechanism, and you can judge whether it's worked or not based on the carbon price, for instance. It has also been something that has been gamed, right? I said the carbon tax would be something that's hard to game. We've had all kinds of weird, you know what I mean by gaming? It means that you find a loophole and you play that loophole, right? So companies are finding ways of shifting emissions to somewhere else where it doesn't count and things like that. We've had some really famous examples of refrigerants that are very, very bad for the climate, and suddenly they're all getting pushed to a particular country or area or industry where, okay, that works, you can do it, right? And it's just, the emissions trading scheme, the way we have it, it encourages people to find loopholes. And that's why all these financial experts who drew it up wanted to have it, because they know where the loopholes are and they get paid $200,000 or $100,000 a year or whatever, right? So this is great business for them. I'm taking a very cynical approach to it. Okay, I think we could make it better, all right? But the political reality of this, we've had it for a decade. The political reality is this is a finance game made by people who make money playing finance games. And we need to be careful about that going forwards. It's going to be really hard to fix. And I know people who go to these Doha and the Poland event and Copenhagen, and they're going to go to Paris. And it's a great place to meet people and hang out, and they enjoy going there, and they come home really devastated because it didn't work again. When does that process stop? When do we give up and say, okay, we're going to do something that works, you know? And the thing that might work is a carbon tax, but you'd have to get it internationally too, so good luck with that. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I think we learned a lot with your presentation, and I imagine we are going to follow you in Twitter, the ones that are not doing. So I think we are going to have a 10-minute break, and we're